I have owned and operated the Sony RX100 Mark IV now for over 4 years, and it is the camera that I reach for when I want a small, portable, compact camera to shoot video. I have bashed this little shooter around on ski fields, mountain bike trips and motorbike trips. I reached out to Sony New Zealand recently and asked if I could have a go with the latest version of this, and that is the Mark VII Sony RX100. Now this model is actually 4 iterations newer than my Mark IV model, and I was specifically interested in seeing what sort of improvements or how it was again to use it like my original Mark IV for shooting video. Hi, I'm Grant, and in terms of high quality compact pocket shooters, the Sony RX100 range has arguably been the king of the hill for quite some time now. Its closest direct competition is probably the Canon G7X line, but I think the G7X is actually lagging behind at the moment. So to me, if you were to break down all the many features that this camera has, its one main feature or selling point is its compact size, or basically it's a high quality shooter in a pocketable compact size. That's it. Whenever a space is a premium, if I'm going out and shooting videos or I'm off on an adventure, then the Sony RX100 is often the camera that I reach for, as opposed to these bigger cameras like my GH5 or even something bigger than that. And that to me is the selling point of this camera. Now, if you are anything like me, when you watch these styles of videos here on YouTube, I want to see that camera or that accessory in action or being used in real life. I could sit here in my nice controlled studio environment with my lights and my microphones, but I don't think that's what this camera is designed for. So with that said, I've got my trusty mountain bike ready and some walking shoes in my backpack, and let's head out with the Sony RX100 Mark VII. So I'll just quickly stop here. So this is a 2-part, I'm going to mountain bike up a track over here, and see that hill there? Now this is a test of the zoom. I'm on the wide 24. Wait for that car. And we're going to head to the top of that hill, and that last part, there you go, my big finger. The last part of that is the walk. So we bike up a track which finishes at the base, and then I'm going to jump into my running shoes and walking shoes and walk to the top of that hill. So that's the long end of the zoom. And that's the 24mm wide end. Let's go. Right, the uphill. Now I'm running this camera in 4K 25p, and I am using a slightly modified portrait picture profile. Sony has, of course, all the Sony picture profiles loaded into this camera, including Sony's S-Log, but I quite like the portrait one for general sort of vlogging use. So sheesh, I'm gonna get puffed. Always seems like a good idea at the time when I'm in my studio to go and do like a ride and sort of camera review, but I end up kind of sweating and running out of breath a little, but we will persevere. Now, one thing I like about this, the Mark VII RX100 over my Mark IV, is that I am shooting in 4K 25p, and I'm shooting it in 60 megabits. It'll shoot 4K 25 and 30p in both 60 and 100 megabits, but I quite like the 60 one for vlogging, or the 60 megabit option for vlogging, because file sizes are smaller, which is great for my aging MacBook Pro. And unless you're doing heavy color grading, the difference when you look at it on a monitor between the 100 megabyte 4K and the 60 megabyte 4K, it's really slight. And also, I rarely shot with 4K on my Mark IV because this was the early days of 4K internal recording, and when you operate the Mark IV RX100 in 4K, the LCD monitor dims. In fact, it dims so much it's almost unusable in outdoor bright light, so you couldn't judge focus and exposure, whereas the LCD monitor on the Mark VII doesn't dim basically at all, so it's still quite usable. And I would have used 4K in this, but the monitor just makes it unusable. And I guess that was because that was the early days of 4K internal recording, and they dim and reduce all the functions to help record the 4K, I'm assuming, and they took a lot more processing power that Mark VII now has at its disposal. So here's another example of the lens. I'm on the wide 24mm end, and we're going to zoom right in here, and that is the optical zoom. Look at that. And that is Cecil Peak, and that is on the 200mm end, and I'm hand holding it, and that stabilization works pretty well. And again, here's the wee small town of Arrowtown that I live in, the bottom of the South Island. That was the 200mm, and there is the 24mm end. So onwards for part 2 of the journey, and might be a good example of the lens again. So I'll show you a quick example where we're going now. So basically I'm going to ditch my bike and change into my walking shoes, and I'm going to walk up this little hill here. Well, it's not a little hill, quite a big hill called Mount Beetham, and I'll show you. So I'm going to walk to the top of this hill. So that's the wide 24mm, and you can actually see someone walking up there. You just see them in there. Someone in there walking. And that's the 200mm end. Now I'm going to be very trusting here and just leave my bike, my shoes and my helmet here. It's a pretty quiet road, but hopefully it'll still be there when I get back. I'll be pretty disappointed if it's not. And that's where we're going. Right, got my sun hat, changed out of my cycle hat into my sun hat, got my sunglasses, got sunscreen on. It's kind of middle of the day, so it's not very flattering light, obviously, for shooting video, but it's what it is often when you're doing these things. And off. Now the other feature that the Mark 7 has that the Mark 4 that I own doesn't have, and that's been fairly well documented now, it has a mic in jack, which is great, except, and this has obviously been fairly well documented on the internet as well, it doesn't have a cold shoe or a hot shoe mount anymore. So if you had, for example, a video micro, there's actually nowhere to mount it. I know Sony's come out with some like bracket handles where you can mount a microphone on the side and your RX100 on the other side, but then that defeats the whole single purpose of this camera to me, being a small and compact unit. So for example, right now I am using a little basically 3.5mm plug-in microphone there, and I'm not sure if you can see that, and that's actually it's a little microphone I had from my DJI Osmo, and I plugged it in. It actually does a pretty good job. It does a better job than the native mics on this camera because it's got a windsock on it, so that'll help. Even though, for example, now there's a light breeze, I'm not sure if that's picking that up or not. If it was just using the native camera microphones, I'm sure they'll be getting that wind noise in there. And the other thing perhaps to be aware of note that I found though, so the native recording setting on this camera is something like 23 or 26. Then when you plug in an external microphone like these, you've got to really crank back the levels because they're too hot for some reason. So this is back to about level 11 to use that microphone, and another lapel mic that I tried was the same thing. So onward. That's my heart rate, 112. Feels worse actually. There's no faking it in these videos. The other feature that this Mark 7 has that my Mark 4 doesn't, and that is an improved autofocus and eye tracking system. In fact, it keeps distracting me. I keep looking into the LCD monitor because I can see a little square on my eye, which it's found and locked onto, which is fantastic. And the other feature I love about these RX100 series of cameras is their high frame rate recording. So you can shoot only up to 25p and 30p in 4K, but in 1920 or 1080p recording you can record up to 120 frames in NTSC and 100 frames in PAL, which is awesome. And these also have high frame rate recording, which supposedly can record up to 960 frames a second, which is ridiculous, and the image quality really falls off. But the 250 is actually pretty good, and here's a little sequence I did with my young fella the other night. We're at the top, and now a bit of a wrap up on this camera. Got a few notes here to wrap up my final thoughts on the Sony RX100 Mark VII, and one of them, we talked about the lens. Now the lens is a fantastic travel zoom range lens, the 24 to 200. However, that's come at a cost. Like for example, my previous RX100 Mark IV was only 24-70, but it was an f1.8 to f2.8. Now this lens is slower. The 24-200 is now f2.8 to f4.5. And the other thing, which is a real bummer, is that they've lost the internal ND. My Mark IV, and I believe the Mark V, still has internal ND, but I guess they couldn't fit it in with this larger lens. But for video, that's a great thing to have, and I used it all the time on my Mark IV camera. And speaking of zoom ranges, I know that the head engineer at Sony Cameras is a big fan of my channel, so if you're listening, I would love the zoom range to be something like 20 to 120 or even 18 to 120, so that gives you a much wider focal length for these types of vlogging situations, but still has enough reach for pulling out detail, and also put the ND back in. That would be awesome. And of course, price. This camera is a high quality compact camera, no doubt, but that also comes at a price. Now I'm just going to refer to my notes on my phone here, and this camera here, the Sony RX100 Mark VII, in New Zealand costs $1,998, and at the moment in the US it is costing $1,198, so it's a bit of money. For example, its direct competition, the Canon G7X Mark III, which has a very similar size and form factor and feature set, that is currently retailing at New Zealand $1,295 and US $749, so quite a bit cheaper than this RX100. So to sum it up, I'm a big fan of the Sony RX100 range for a compact travel or vlog style of point and shoot camera, and especially all the feature set that you can dive into once you get in it. You can grow with the camera. It has a lot of built-in video features that as you get more experience that you'll start to use and get better and better results. However, if someone was to ask me, we have I think 8 RX100 models now, right back from the 1 through to 7, but there was also a Mark V and a Mark V-A. Now the longer lens, the last time it had the faster lens and the 24-70 and the faster lens at the f1.8 was the Mark V. So if someone was to say to me, should I get the Mark V or the latest Mark VII, it would depend on how much lens and the style of shooting you want to do. If you are a travel vlogger, for example, and you want a long range lens, obviously the longer the Mark VII is going to be better. However, if you want, perhaps it's not a big deal and you like the more shallow depth of field and built-in ND, then I would say go for the Mark V. So if I was to pick one, if I had to buy an RX100 again, I think I would go for the Mark VII, because I like the ability to have the 4K 25p, the external mic if I need it, and the long range zoom, because often I use this in conjunction with a GoPro, which actually is a direct competitor to this. It doesn't have the lens range, but it's waterproof, it has a big wide lens as we all know, and it has high frame rate recording, and it is again a compact shooter. So that's it from me. Now I couldn't come all the way up here without leaving you with a few hero shots not shot on the RX100, and I will see you in the next video.